The blazing Arizona sun cast long shadows across Copper Creek as Samuel Blackwood rode in on his dappled gray stallion. Dust clung to his weathered duster, a testament to the 3 days he'd spent on the trail. At 45, his face was a map of the hard years behind him. Deep lines around eyes that missed nothing, a thin scar running along his jaw, and a salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed despite his travels. The town had grown since he'd last passed through, with the newly established Frontier Bank standing proudly on the main street. Samuel's hand instinctively brushed against the Colt .45 holstered at his hip as he surveyed the scene before him. This wasn't a social call. He'd come for business, dangerous business, at the request of an old acquaintance. The letter had been specific. "I fear for my wife's safety. Previous men have failed. Your reputation precedes you. Payment will be substantial." It was signed simply, Harrison Wells, Frontier Bank. Hey friends, if you're enjoying this story so far, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to know, what city are you watching from today? Samuel dismounted outside the Red Mountain Saloon, tethering his horse to the hitching post before climbing the weathered wooden steps. Inside, the familiar sounds of a honky-tonk piano, clinking glasses, and murmured conversations washed over him. He removed his wide-brimmed hat, reviewing more gray than brown in his close-cropped hair, and made his way to the bar. The barkeep, a burly man with an impressive mustache, slid a whiskey toward him without being asked. "Word travels fast in small towns," Samuel muttered, downing the amber liquid in one practiced motion. He'd need information before meeting with Wells, and saloons were always the best place to start. A young man in the corner kept stealing glances his way. Samuel recognized the look, part fear, part admiration. His reputation as a former Texas Ranger turned hired gun had apparently preceded him, just as Wells had written. "You must be Blackwood," came a voice from behind. Samuel turned slowly, years of survival instincts preventing any sudden movements. The man who addressed him was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, gold watch chain glinting in the dim light. Harrison Wells, presumably. "Mr. Wells," Samuel acknowledged with a slight nod. "Perhaps we should discuss your letter somewhere more private." Wells nodded, gesturing toward a back room. As they walked, Samuel noted how conversations hushed momentarily, eyes following them. Wells was clearly an important man in Copper Creek, but Samuel detected an undercurrent of resentment among some patrons. That was useful information. In his line of work, knowing who a man's enemies were often proved as valuable as knowing his friends. Whatever trouble Mrs. Wells was in, it likely connected to her husband's position and the power it afforded him. The back room was sparsely furnished but private. Wells closed the door and immediately began pacing. "I'll be direct, Mr. Blackwood. There have been 3 attempts on my wife's life in the past month. Notes left at our home suggest more to come." Samuel remained standing, his back to the wall, another habit that had kept him alive. "Any idea who's behind it?" he asked, studying Wells's face for tells. The banker paused, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. "I've made enemies, men who've lost their ranches to foreclosure, competitors who resent the bank's success." There was something Wells wasn't saying. Samuel was certain of it. "And the local law?" Wells scoffed. "Sheriff Taylor is competent enough for drunken cowboys and petty thieves. But this requires someone of your particular talents. I need a man who can watch over my wife, discreetly, while I identify the threat." Samuel had worked protection jobs before, but something about Wells' demeanor put him on edge. "I don't come cheap," he stated flatly. Wells smiled thinly. $500 for 1 month of service. Half now, half upon completion. It was an extraordinary sum, enough to buy a small ranch, and further evidence that there was more to this situation than Wells was letting on. Samuel considered refusing. Complicated jobs had a way of becoming dangerous very quickly. But $500 would set him up nicely, perhaps even allow him to finally stop drifting. "I'll need complete autonomy to do this properly," he countered. "And understand this, I'm not an assassin. I protect and defend, nothing more." Wells nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. Of course. You'll stay at our home as my wife's cousin from back east. My household staff is discreet." They sealed the agreement with a handshake, and Wells counted out $250 from a money clip. "Come by the bank tomorrow morning. You'll meet my wife then." Samuel pocketed the money, his expression unchanged despite the weight of the coins. "One more thing," he said as Wells reached for the door. "Once the job is done, I move on. That's how I operate. No loose ends, no complications." The banker smiled. "Perfectly understood, Mr. Blackwood. 1 month, and then you're free to disappear back into the frontier." As Wells left, Samuel remained in the room, contemplating what he'd just agreed to. Something didn't sit right, but he'd committed now. 1 month in Copper Creek, and then he'd be gone. That was his way, never staying long enough to form attachments, to become vulnerable. Samuel had learned that lesson the hard way 15 years ago in Dodge City. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Dawn broke over Copper Creek, painting the mountains with gold and crimson. Samuel had spent the night at the modest hotel across from the saloon, sleeping lightly as was his custom. After a simple breakfast, he gathered his few possessions, checked his weapons, the Colt at his hip and a smaller Derringer in his boot, and made his way toward the Frontier Bank. The town was different in the morning light. Shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, freight wagons rumbled down the dusty street, and ladies in fine dresses navigated the uneven wooden sidewalks with practiced grace. The bank itself was an imposing 2-story building of red brick, unusual for these parts and a clear statement of Wells' ambitions. Samuel entered precisely at 9 o'clock, nodding to the armed guard at the door, who returned the gesture with professional courtesy, one predator recognizing another. Mr. Blackwood rode on time. Wells emerged from his office, today dressed in an even finer suit than the previous evening. "Please, come in." The banker's office spoke of wealth and Eastern tastes, leather-bound books, a massive oak desk, and a painting of what Samuel assumed was the New York skyline. "My wife will be joining us shortly. She's aware only that you're providing additional security due to the threats. The full nature of your background remains between us." Samuel remained standing, uncomfortable with the opulence surrounding him. "As you wish, but I'll need to be honest with her about security measures." Wells waved his hand dismissively. "Of course, whatever is necessary for her protection." "Ah, here she is now." The office door opened, and Samuel turned, then froze, his practiced composure momentarily slipping. Elizabeth Wells was nothing like what Samuel had expected. Where he had imagined a fragile, pampered banker's wife, stood a woman of remarkable presence. Her chestnut hair was elegantly styled, her deep blue dress tailored to perfection. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, intelligent, assessing, and somehow familiar. "Mrs. Wells, may I present Samuel Blackwood," Harrison announced formally. Elizabeth extended her hand, which Samuel took after a moment's hesitation. "Mr. Blackwood, my husband speaks highly of your abilities." Her voice carried the refined tones of an Eastern education, but underneath Samuel detected something else, perhaps the faintest trace of a Western accent carefully hidden. "Ma'am," he responded simply, releasing her hand and resuming his professional demeanor. "I understand you've been experiencing some threats. I'm here to ensure they remain just that, threats, not actions." "Then we are fortunate to have you," Elizabeth replied, meeting his gaze directly, uncommon for most ladies of her standing. There was something in that look that suggested she was taking his measure just as carefully as he was taking hers. Wells cleared his throat. "Samuel will be staying at our home, presented as your cousin from back east. The servants have been informed." Elizabeth's eyebrow arched slightly. "Indeed? And does my cousin have a particular profession that brings him west?" The question was directed at Samuel, not her husband, another small detail that didn't escape his notice. "Land speculation," Samuel answered smoothly, "considering investments in the growing territories." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with the cover story. "Well then, cousin, shall we acquaint you with your new temporary home? I imagine you'll want to assess the property for investment potential." The Wells residence sat on a hill overlooking the town. A grand two-story home with a wraparound porch and manicured gardens that must have required constant attention in the harsh desert climate. It spoke of money, lots of it, and a determination to recreate Eastern comforts in this untamed land. Samuel rode alongside the Wells carriage, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, noting sightlines, potential approaches, and defensible positions. Old habits from his ranger days. As they approached, he spotted at least 2 good sniper positions on the ridges beyond, something he'd need to address. The household staff, a cook, 2 maids, a gardener, and a stable hand, were lined up to greet them. Another Eastern custom that seemed out of place here. Samuel noted how they deferred to Harrison, that seemed genuinely fond of Elizabeth. "Mr. Blackwood will be staying in the East Wing guest room," Harrison instructed the head maid, an older woman named Mrs. Porter. "Please ensure he has everything he requires." The banker then turned to Samuel. "I must return to the bank. Business demands my attention even more with these distractions. I trust you'll begin your duties immediately." It wasn't a question. Samuel nodded once, his expression unreadable. As Harrison departed, Samuel became acutely aware that he was now alone with Elizabeth Wells, the woman he was hired to protect, the banker's wife, and inexplicably, the most intriguing person he'd encountered in years. "Well, Cousin Samuel," Elizabeth said with a slight smile playing at her lips, "shall I show you the grounds myself? I imagine you'll want to become familiar with every inch of the property." Samuel spent the remainder of that first day methodically assessing the Wells estate. Elizabeth proved to be an unexpectedly knowledgeable companion, pointing out not just the home's features, but also its vulnerabilities. The kitchen door that didn't lock properly, the window in the study that stuck half open, the section of garden wall that had crumbled just enough to create a foothold. "You have a good eye for security, Mrs. Wells," Samuel remarked as they completed their circuit. Elizabeth's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "When one receives death threats, Mr. Blackwood, one develops certain awareness." She led him to a small gazebo overlooking the town below. "Please, sit. I believe it's time we spoke frankly." Samuel hesitated, then took a seat opposite her, his position allowing him to keep watch on the approaches to their location. "My husband has not told you everything," Elizabeth stated without preamble. Samuel wasn't surprised, but he kept his expression neutral. Few clients do, ma'am. She studied him for a moment. The threats against me began after 3 ranchers took their own lives following foreclosures by my husband's bank. The directness of her statement caught Samuel slightly off guard. Most ladies of her standing would avoid such unpleasant topics. Their families blame Harrison's lending practices, perhaps rightfully so. Samuel leaned forward slightly. "And what do you believe, Mrs. Wells?" The question was bold, perhaps inappropriate, but necessary. Elizabeth's gaze drifted toward the distant mountains. "I believe my husband has forgotten that banking should serve the community, not destroy it. But that hardly justifies threats against my life, wouldn't you agree?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Violence rarely solves anything," he said, the words feeling hollow given his profession. "But people who feel cornered often lash out." Elizabeth turned back to him, her eyes searching his face. "Is that what happened to you, Mr. Blackwood? Did you feel cornered once?" The personal question crossed a line, and Samuel's expression hardened. "We're discussing your safety, Mrs. Wells, not my past." To his surprise, Elizabeth didn't retreat from his sudden coldness. "I apologize for overstepping, but if we're to convince anyone that we're family, we should know something about each other, shouldn't we?" Her logic was sound, her manner disarming. Samuel found himself nodding reluctantly. "What would you like to know?" Elizabeth smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Everything you're willing to share, Cousin Samuel. We have a month ahead of us, after all." The next 2 weeks fell into an unexpected rhythm. By day, Samuel escorted Elizabeth on her errands and social calls in town, maintaining the pretense of being her visiting cousin while constantly vigilant for threats. The banker's wife, he discovered, was deeply involved in the community, visiting the small schoolhouse where she sometimes taught, bringing baskets to families in need, and even tending to minor ailments as an unofficial nurse when the town doctor was overwhelmed. "You're not what I expected," Samuel admitted one afternoon as they walked back from delivering supplies to a miner's widow. Elizabeth glanced at him, amusement in her eyes. "And what did you expect, Mr. Blackwood? A delicate flower who spends her days with embroidery and gossip?" He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Something like that, yes." By night, Samuel patrolled the property, checked windows and doors, and occasionally ventured into town to gather intelligence about potential threats. It was during one such excursion at the Red Mountain Saloon that he overheard conversations that troubled him. "Wells is squeezing old Jenkins now," muttered one weather-beaten rancher to another. "After what happened to Miller and the others, you'd think he'd show some mercy." His companion spat tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "That banker's got ice in his veins, but they say his wife's different. Help the Miller children after." The men noticed Samuel then and fell silent, recognizing him as the Wells house guest. Samuel finished his whiskey and departed, but the conversation stayed with him. The threat to Elizabeth might be real, but it seemed increasingly possible that her husband was the true target of the town's resentment. On the 15th day of his employment, Samuel found Elizabeth in the garden at dawn, tending to a small patch of herbs, an unusual hobby for a woman of her station. She wore a simple dress, her hair loosely braided down her back, looking more like a farmer's daughter than a banker's wife. "You're up early," he commented, keeping a respectful distance. Elizabeth didn't look up from her work. "I've always preferred mornings. Everything feels possible at dawn." She brushed soil from her hands and finally turned to him. There was another note. Samuel tensed immediately. "Where?" Elizabeth reached into her pocket and extracted a folded paper. "Under my bedroom door this morning. I haven't shown Harrison." Samuel took the note carefully, mindful of preserving any evidence. The message was simple but chilling. Your husband's sins will be paid in blood, soon. This was delivered inside the house, Samuel stated, his tone hardening. Someone on the staff. Elizabeth shook her head firmly. I trust my staff completely. This came from outside. Samuel frowned. Mrs. Wells, with all due respect, I've been watching this property. No one could have. She interrupted him again. There's a hidden passage from the wine cellar that leads to the creek bed. It's not on any house plans. Samuel stared at her in disbelief and growing anger. And you didn't think to mention this before? Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. I'm mentioning it now. I believed it was sealed years ago, but evidently I was mistaken. Perhaps you should investigate it before Harrison returns from his business trip tomorrow. Her calm in the face of such danger was remarkable and concerning. The passage was exactly where Elizabeth had described, a narrow tunnel behind a false wall in the cellar, clearly designed when the house was built. This was no afterthought, Samuel muttered as he examined the craftsmanship of the hidden door. Who built this house, Mrs. Wells? Elizabeth held the lantern higher, illuminating the dank passageway. It belonged to Harrison's first business partner, Jacob Thornton. Harrison acquired it after Jacob's death 5 years ago. There was something in her tone that made Samuel look at her sharply. You knew Thornton? A shadow passed across Elizabeth's face. Everyone in Copper Creek knew Jacob. He founded the town, established the first trading post. He was a good man. The passage led exactly where she'd said, emerging cleverly disguised among boulders near the creek, completely hidden from view of the house. As they made their way back through the tunnel, Samuel's mind worked furiously. This changes things. I need to seal this entrance immediately and set watches. And you should not be alone, not even in the house. Elizabeth placed her hand lightly on his arm, the first time she had initiated physical contact. I'm not afraid, Samuel. The use of his first name caught him off guard. Perhaps you should be, he replied, his voice rougher than intended. They emerged into the cellar, the normalcy of the wine racks and storage shelves, a stark contrast to the secret they'd just explored. Elizabeth carefully closed the false door, which blended seamlessly into the wall once more. Fear is a poor advisor, my father always said. Samuel studied her face in the lantern light. Your father sounds like a wise man. Elizabeth's smile was tinged with sadness. He was. He taught me to shoot, to ride, to survive. Not typical lessons for a banker's daughter. Samuel spent the remainder of the day reinforcing the house's security, blocking the secret passage with heavy furniture, checking every window and door, and instructing the stable hand to saddle a horse and keep it ready at all times. He also wrote a message to Sheriff Taylor, carefully worded to alert him to potential trouble without revealing the full situation. As night fell, the house seemed unnaturally quiet, with Harrison away and most of the staff dismissed early on Elizabeth's orders. Samuel found her in the study, reading by lamplight, seemingly unconcerned by the threats against her life. You should try to rest, Mrs. Wells. I'll keep watch. Elizabeth marked her place in her book, Thoreau's Walden, he noted, and regarded him thoughtfully. Will you answer a question honestly, Samuel? He nodded cautiously. If I can, why did you agree to this job? Harrison is paying you well, certainly, but money doesn't seem to be what drives you. The question was perceptive, uncomfortably so. Samuel remained standing, his habitual position by the door. I'm good at keeping people safe, It's one of the few useful skills I have left. Elizabeth shook her head slightly. That's not an answer. Not a real one. Samuel felt a flicker of irritation. With respect, Mrs. Wells, my reasons are my own. She rose from her chair then, approaching him with a directness that was both inappropriate and somehow inevitable. I think you're running, Samuel Blackwood. The question is, from what? They stood too close now, close enough that he could detect the faint scent of lavender in her hair. We all have ghosts, Samuel finally said, his voice low. I find it's best not to invite them to supper. Elizabeth didn't retreat from his space as propriety would dictate. My maiden name was Elizabeth Thornton, she said instead, the revelation landing between them like a physical presence. Jacob Thornton was my father. Samuel's mind raced, connecting pieces that suddenly made terrible sense. Her knowledge of the house, her comfort with the town, despite her Eastern airs, the respect shown by the old-timers. You married your father's business partner, he stated flatly. Elizabeth's chin lifted slightly. After my father died, Harrison offered security, position. It seemed practical at the time. The word practical hung in the air, weighted with all it didn't say about her marriage. And now? Samuel asked, knowing he was crossing boundaries he'd promised himself to respect. Now I wonder if I made a grave mistake, Elizabeth answered, her honesty startling in its rawness. The partner my father trusted has become someone I barely recognize. The bank that was meant to help build this community is destroying lives. She turned away abruptly, moving to the window. I've said too much. Forget my words, Mr. Blackwood. The return to formality was a clear attempt to rebuild the wall between them. But it was too late. Something fundamental had shifted. Elizabeth, he said softly, testing her name on his tongue for the first time. Are you in danger from the townspeople or from your husband? She didn't turn around, but he saw how her shoulders tensed at the question. I think perhaps both, she whispered. The notes began after I questioned Harrison's foreclosure policies at a bank meeting, publicly. Before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the moment. Harrison isn't due back until tomorrow, Elizabeth said, alarm clear in her voice. Samuel moved instantly, extinguishing the lamp and pulling Elizabeth away from the window. Stay here, out of sight, he instructed, drawing his Colt. He moved silently through the darkened house to the front door, positioning himself to the side of the entrance, gun ready. The rider approached the house directly, not attempting stealth, which could mean it wasn't a threat, or it was a very confident one. A pounding at the door confirmed it wasn't someone attempting a stealthy entry. Mrs. Wells, it's Sheriff Taylor. I need to speak with you urgently. Samuel didn't lower his weapon, but called out, What's the emergency, Sheriff? There's been an incident at Miller's Crossing, Taylor called back. Harrison Wells was attacked on his return journey. He's at Doc Sullivan's office now. Elizabeth appeared beside Samuel, ignoring his gesture to stay back. Is he alive? She called out. Yes, ma'am, but badly injured. He's asking for you. Samuel and Elizabeth exchanged glances. This could be legitimate, or a trap to draw them out. We'll follow you into town, Sheriff, Samuel decided. Give us 5 minutes to saddle up. As the sheriff retreated, Samuel turned to Elizabeth. I don't like this. The timing is too convenient. Elizabeth was already reaching for her shawl. Nevertheless, we must go. If it's a trap, at least we're walking into it with open eyes. Her calm pragmatism in the face of danger continued to impress him. The ride into town was tense. Samuel keeping his horse close to Elizabeth's, one hand near his holster at all times. Copper Creek was eerily quiet in the late evening. Most businesses closed except for the saloon and notably Doc Sullivan's office, which blazed with light. Sheriff Taylor waited for them outside, his weathered face grim. He was ambushed at the crossing, shot twice. Doc got the bullets out, but he's lost a lot of blood. Elizabeth dismounted with practiced grace. Who found him? The question was pointed, and Samuel approved of her caution. Stagecoach driver spotted him and brought him in, Taylor answered. Mrs. Wells, he's asking for you, specifically. Says it's urgent, private. The sheriff's eyes flicked to Samuel. Alone. That's not happening, Samuel stated flatly. Elizabeth placed a restraining hand on his arm. It's all right, Samuel. I'll see him, but you'll be just outside the door. Her tone brooked no argument, and Samuel reluctantly nodded. As Elizabeth entered the doctor's office, Samuel pulled the sheriff aside. Tell me exactly what happened. Taylor sighed heavily. Ambush, plain and simple. Professional job, too. Shots from distance, no witnesses. If the stage hadn't come along when it did, Samuel frowned. Any suspects? Taylor's expression darkened. Half the county has reason to hate Wells, Blackwood. But this wasn't some angry farmer with a grudge. This was a hired gun's work. Samuel absorbed this information silently. A professional hit complicated matters significantly. Inside the doctor's office, Elizabeth found Harrison pale and bandaged, but conscious. Elizabeth, he wheezed, reaching for her hand. She took it, her face composed. Who did this to you, Harrison? The banker's laugh turned into a painful cough. Always direct, my dear. One of the many things that drew me to you. His eyes darted to the door. Is he out there? Your cousin? Elizabeth stiffened slightly. Blackwood is concerned for my safety, as you hired him to be. Harrison's grip on her hand tightened painfully. I know about the notes, Elizabeth. Not just the ones sent to you, but the ones you've been sending to yourself. The accusation hung in the air between them. What are you talking about? Elizabeth asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Harrison's smile was cold, despite his weakened state. Did you think I wouldn't investigate? The threats began right after you challenged me publicly about the foreclosures. His voice dropped to a whisper. I know you've been helping those families, using your inheritance from Jacob behind my back. Elizabeth pulled her hand free, her expression hardening. Those people needed help after what you did to them. My father would never have approved of your methods, Harrison. The banker's face twisted with anger. Your precious father was weak. He would have kept this town a backwater trading post. I've built something significant. His voice rose, then broke into another coughing fit. Elizabeth stepped back. You've built your fortune on the suffering of others. My father built relationships, community. There's a difference. Harrison's eyes narrowed dangerously. Be careful, Elizabeth. Remember who holds the power in this marriage. The door opened then, Samuel entering despite the doctor's protests. One look at Elizabeth's face told him all he needed to know. We're leaving, he stated. Not a question, but a command. Harrison struggled to sit up. You work for me, Blackwood. She stays. Samuel's hand moved to his holster. Not anymore. He turned to Elizabeth. We need to go. Now. She nodded once, her decision made in that moment. As they moved toward the door, Harrison called after them. This isn't over, Elizabeth. Everything you have exists because of me. Samuel guided her out with a protective hand at her back, his senses on high alert. Outside, he noticed immediately that Sheriff Taylor was nowhere to be seen, and the street was unnaturally empty. "Something's wrong," he murmured. "Stay close to me." They mounted their horses quickly, but before they could ride out, shots rang out from the direction of the saloon. Samuel immediately positioned his horse to shield Elizabeth, drawing his colt in one fluid motion. "Make for the livery stable," he instructed tersely. "We'll cut through the back and head for the hills." Elizabeth surprised him by drawing a small derringer from her skirts. "I told you my father taught me well," she said in response to his raised eyebrow. They rode hard for the livery, bullets kicking up dust behind them. Inside the dim stable, Samuel dismounted quickly, leading Elizabeth to the back exit. "Harrison arranged this," Elizabeth said, her voice tight with anger. "The attack on him was probably staged to draw us out." Samuel nodded grimly. "Likely, but why now?" "The bank," Elizabeth realized suddenly. "There's a directors' meeting tomorrow. Without my vote, Harrison can implement his new lending policies unopposed." Samuel was impressed, despite the dire situation. "You've been blocking him." It wasn't a question. Elizabeth nodded. "My father left me controlling interest in the bank. Harrison has been trying to change that for years, but the charter is clear. Without me, because." Samuel completed her thought. He finally has free rein. A noise at the front of the stable alerted them to pursuit. "We need to move," Samuel whispered, guiding her through the back door. "I know a place," Elizabeth said urgently. "My father's old hunting cabin. It's in the foothills, well hidden. Harrison doesn't know about it." Samuel nodded once. "Lead the way." They rode through the night, taking little-used trails into the rugged foothills beyond Copper Creek. The moon provided just enough light to navigate, but also made them visible to potential pursuers. Samuel insisted they cross streams whenever possible to break their trail, a ranger tactic that had served him well over the years. Elizabeth rode with surprising skill and endurance, never complaining despite the punishing pace. It was nearly dawn when they finally reached the cabin, a simple one-room structure nestled against a rock face, almost invisible among the pines. "Father built this himself," Elizabeth explained as she dismounted stiffly. "We would come here when he needed to think, away from the pressures of town." Samuel secured the horses in a small lean-to behind the cabin, making sure they were hidden from casual observation. The interior was dusty but otherwise well-maintained. A stone fireplace, a simple bed, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with preserved foods and other essentials. "Jacob believed in being prepared," Elizabeth said, lighting a lamp. Samuel checked the windows and door, satisfied that they could be adequately secured. "We should be safe here for tonight at least. Tomorrow, we'll need to make plans." Elizabeth sank into one of the chairs, the events of the night finally catching up with her. "I've lost everything, haven't I?" she said softly. "The house, the bank, my position in town." Samuel paused in his security checks, struck by the vulnerability in her voice. "You've lost things," he corrected gently. "Not everything." Their eyes met across the small room, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the cabin in soft golden light. Samuel had maintained watch through the night, allowing Elizabeth a few hours of fitful sleep on the narrow bed. As she stirred, he poured her a cup of coffee from the pot he'd prepared over the small fire. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said, handing her the steaming cup. Elizabeth accepted it gratefully, her hair loose around her shoulders, making her look younger than her 35 years. "Harrison won't stop," she said after taking a sip. "Not until he has complete control of the bank and has eliminated any threat I might pose to his reputation." Samuel nodded grimly. Which means you're not safe in Copper Creek, or anywhere he might think to look for you. Elizabeth's eyes were clear and direct as she looked at him. I could leave. Start over somewhere else. Denver, perhaps, or San Francisco. The thought of her leaving created an unexpected hollow feeling in Samuel's chest. You could, he agreed, keeping his tone neutral. But would you be satisfied knowing what Harrison will do to the town your father built? To the people you've tried to help? Elizabeth stood and moved to the small window, looking out at the pine-covered slopes. No, she admitted quietly. I wouldn't. But I don't see how I can stop him. He has money, influence, hired guns. Samuel joined her at the window, careful to maintain a proper distance despite the intimacy of their situation. You have something he doesn't, he said. The truth and legitimate claim to your father's legacy. Elizabeth turned to face him, hope and doubt warring in her expression. What are you suggesting? Samuel had been considering their options through the long night watch. The bank charter, he said. You mentioned it gives you controlling interest. Is they a physical copy? Elizabeth's eyes widened. Yes, in my father's lockbox. I keep it in... She trailed off, realization dawning. In the compartment behind the wine cellar passage, Samuel allowed himself a small smile. The passage Harrison doesn't know you showed me. Elizabeth's answering smile was like the sunrise, full of warmth and possibility. Samuel Blackwood, are you suggesting we steal into my own house and reclaim what's rightfully mine? He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. I'm suggesting we consider all options, Mrs. Wells. Elizabeth, she corrected him softly. After all we've been through, I think you've earned the right to use my given name. Samuel cleared his throat, unexpectedly moved by the simple intimacy of her request. Elizabeth, he repeated, the name feeling right on his tongue. We need a plan, and we need allies. Sheriff Taylor may be in Harrison's pocket, but there must be others in town who remember your father, who understand what's happening with the bank. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. Judge Wilson, he was my father's friend, and he's never approved of Harrison's methods. And Mrs. Porter, my housekeeper, she was my mother's confidant before she passed. She'd help us get into the house. Samuel considered this information carefully. Good. We'll approach them discreetly. But first, we need to know what we're facing. I'll scout the town tonight. Not alone, Elizabeth stated firmly. I'm coming with you. Samuel started to object, then recognized the determination in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in seasoned rangers who wouldn't be dissuaded from a course of action. It's dangerous, he said instead, a final token protest. Elizabeth's response was to retrieve a Winchester rifle from beneath the bed, checking it with practiced hands. Life is dangerous, Samuel, particularly when one's husband is trying to arrange one's demise. There was a dark humor in her tone that he couldn't help but appreciate. We leave at dusk, he conceded. Stay close to me, follow my lead, and if I say run, Elizabeth finished for him. I run. I understand. The day stretched before them, hours of waiting in close quarters, planning for a night of danger. Samuel found himself more aware of Elizabeth than ever. Her movements, her scent, the way sunlight caught in her hair. The town was eerily quiet as they approached after nightfall, keeping to the shadows and back alleys. Samuel had insisted they leave the horses hidden outside town, approaching on foot for stealth. They made their way first to Judge Wilson's modest home at the edge of town. The judge, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes despite his 70 years, admitted them through his back door after a moment of shocked recognition. Elizabeth Thornton, as I live and breathe, They're saying in town you've run off with your cousin? His knowing glance at Samuel made it clear he wasn't fooled by the cover story. "Not my cousin, Judge Wilson," Elizabeth said quietly, "but a good man nonetheless. We need your help." Inside, over glasses of brandy, they explained the situation. The judge listened gravely, his expression darkening at the mention of Harrison's ambitions and methods. "I've been concerned about the bank's practices for some time," Wilson admitted. "But without proof, and with Harrison's growing influence," he shook his head, "the charter would be evidence enough, especially with your testimony, my dear. But getting it will be dangerous. Wells has men watching the house, not just for your return, but to stop anyone from accessing whatever might be hidden inside." Samuel leaned forward. "What kind of men? How many?" The judge considered. "3 that I've seen. Hired guns from out of town. Professional types." Samuel exchanged glances with Elizabeth. The odds weren't good, but they'd faced worse. "We need to get a message to Mrs. Porter," Elizabeth said. "She can tell us if the passage entrance from the creek is being watched." Judge Wilson nodded. "I can arrange that. My clerk's sweetheart is a laundry girl who delivers to your house." With the judge's help, they formulated a plan. Mrs. Porter would create a distraction the following evening, a small kitchen fire. Nothing dangerous, but enough to draw attention, while Samuel and Elizabeth accessed the hidden passage from the creek. Meanwhile, the judge would prepare legal papers invalidating any decisions made by Harrison in Elizabeth's absence. "Once we have the charter," Elizabeth explained, "we'll bring it directly to you. Can you convene the bank directors?" Wilson's smile was wolf-like. "My dear, for Jacob Thornton's daughter and the good of this town, I'll convene them at midnight if necessary." As they prepared to leave, the judge took Samuel aside. "You care for her," he observed quietly. It wasn't a question. Samuel didn't deny it. "She deserves better than what she's had," he said simply. Wilson studied him thoughtfully. "Indeed she does. See that she gets it." The following evening found them crouched by the creek bed, hidden among the boulders that concealed the passage entrance. They'd spent the day at the cabin, preparing and resting for the night ahead. Now, as the sun set behind the mountains, they waited for Mrs. Porter's signal. A lantern placed briefly in the kitchen window. "Are you certain about this?" Samuel asked Elizabeth one last time. "Once we're inside, there's no turning back." In the fading light, her expression was serene, despite the danger they faced. "I've spent 5 years turning away from things, Samuel. From the truth about Harrison, from my responsibility to this town, from what I truly want." Her hand found his in the growing darkness. "I'm not turning away anymore." The lantern appeared in the window, a brief flicker of light that signaled their moment had come. Samuel located the hidden mechanism that Jacob Thornton had built into the rock face, a testament to the man's ingenuity. The passage door swung open silently, revealing the narrow tunnel beyond. Samuel entered first, lantern held low, his Colt drawn and ready in his right hand. Elizabeth followed close behind, the Winchester cradled in her arms. The passage was just as they'd left it, undisturbed. "They don't know about it," Elizabeth whispered, hope evident in her voice. Samuel remained cautious. "Stay alert anyway. Plans have a way of going wrong at the worst possible moment." They moved through the tunnel efficiently, reaching the wine cellar entrance within minutes. Samuel pressed his ear to the false door, listening for any movement beyond. Hearing nothing, he eased it open just enough to peer into the cellar. The cellar appeared empty, the house above unusually quiet. "Something's not right," Samuel murmured. "There should be more activity, even with a diversion." Elizabeth placed a restraining hand on his arm. Perhaps they've reduced the staff further in my absence. Samuel wasn't convinced, but they had come too far to turn back now. They slipped into the cellar, moving silently between the wine racks toward the hidden compartment Elizabeth had described. It was cleverly designed, a section of stone wall that pivoted when the correct sequence of stones was pressed. Inside, they found a small iron lockbox. "This is it," Elizabeth breathed, reaching for the key she wore on a chain around her neck. Her fingers trembled slightly as she inserted it into the lock. The click of the lock opening was followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of a hammer being cocked. "I must admit, I'm impressed," came Harrison Wells' voice from the cellar stairs. Light flooded the room as lanterns were raised, revealing Harrison seated in a wheelchair at the top of the stairs, flanked by two armed men. Another gunman stepped from behind a rack of wine barrels, his revolver trained on Samuel. The passage was a surprise. Harrison continued conversationally. Jacob always did like his secrets, rather like his daughter. Samuel calculated their odds, 3 gunmen plus Harrison, who despite his injuries held a derringer pointed at Elizabeth. Not good, but not impossible. "How did you know?" Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite their predicament. Harrison's smile was cold. "Mrs. Porter has been loyal to you, my dear, but her grandson owes significant gambling debts. Amazing how forthcoming people become when the right pressure is applied." He gestured to the lockbox. "The charter, if you please. Then perhaps we can discuss terms for your disappearance." Samuel tensed, ready to move at the slightest opportunity. Elizabeth's hand tightened around the lockbox. "No, Harrison. My father built this bank to serve this community, not to prey upon it. I won't let you destroy his legacy." Harrison's expression hardened. "Your father was a fool who died broke because he lacked vision. I built the Frontier Bank into what it is today. Those papers are rightfully mine." Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. "Is that what you told yourself when you tampered with his saddle?" When his horse threw him on a trail he'd ridden 1,000 times, Samuel saw the shock register on the faces of Harrison's men. Clearly, this accusation was news to them. Harrison's face flushed with anger. "You can't prove that," he hissed. "No one can." Elizabeth opened the lockbox, removing not just the charter, but another document. "My father kept a journal, Harrison. He suspected you. The night before he died, he wrote his concerns and placed them here, along with the name of the stable hand you bribed." The revelation landed like a physical blow. One of the gunmen shifted uncomfortably, his weapon lowering slightly. Samuel saw their opportunity. "Even hired guns have limits, Wells," he said loudly. "Murder of a town founder? That's not what they signed on for." Harrison's eyes darted between his men, noting their hesitation. "Shoot them," he commanded. "Double pay for both." The next moments unfolded in a blur of action. Samuel dove for Elizabeth, pulling her down behind a wine rack as the first shots rang out. But the gunfire wasn't directed at them. Instead, one of Harrison's own men had turned on the others, creating chaos in the confined space. Samuel didn't question this stroke of fortune, instead, pulling his Colt and returning fire, aiming carefully despite the poor light and moving targets. Elizabeth clutched the lockbox and documents to her chest with one hand, her derringer ready in the other. "The passage," Samuel shouted over the gunfire. "Go!" Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "Not without you." Her loyalty moved something deep within him, but there was no time to dwell on it. "Together then. On my mark." He fired twice more, creating the opening they needed, then grabbed her hand. "Now!" They made a desperate dash for the hidden passage, bullets splintering wood around them. Samuel felt a white-hot pain across his upper arm, but ignored it, focusing on getting Elizabeth to safety. They tumbled through the false door, Samuel pausing just long enough to jam it shut with a broken wine bottle. It wouldn't hold for long, but might buy them precious minutes. They raced through the tunnel, the sounds of pursuit growing more distant. "You're hit," Elizabeth gasped, noticing the blood soaking his sleeve. "Keep moving," Samuel responded grimly. "It's just a graze." They emerged at the creek bed, the night air cool on their faces. Without discussion, they headed for the judge's house, taking a circuitous route through back alleys and shadows. Judge Wilson admitted them immediately, his eyes widening at their appearance, Samuel bleeding, Elizabeth clutching the documents, both of them dusty and disheveled. "Good God," he exclaimed. "What happened?" Elizabeth placed the charter and journal on his desk. "We have everything we need, Judge, and more. Evidence that Harrison murdered my father." Wilson's expression grew somber. "That's a serious accusation, Elizabeth." She nodded, her face set with determination. "With proof to support it, and witnesses now. Harrison's own men heard his admission." Samuel sank into a chair, allowing Elizabeth to examine his wounded arm. Her touch was gentle, but competent, as she cleaned and bandaged the injury. "What now?" Samuel asked the judge. "Wells will be desperate, dangerous." "Now," Wilson said firmly, "we use the legal system as it was intended. I'll summon Sheriff Taylor and the town council immediately. Harrison's influence is substantial, but murder changes everything." He looked at Elizabeth. "You should both remain here. My home has been fortified since the border troubles. It's defensible if Wells and his remaining men try anything foolish." Samuel and Elizabeth exchanged glances, a silent communication born of their shared ordeal. "We'll stay," Samuel decided. As the judge departed to make arrangements, they found themselves alone in his study. "You were right," Elizabeth said softly. "About everything." Samuel shook his head. "Not everything. I thought this job would be simple. A month of work, then move on as always. I never expected." He trailed off, unable to articulate the profound shift in his world. Elizabeth moved closer, propriety forgotten in the wake of all they'd endured. "What did you never expect, Samuel?" The directness of her question deserved an honest answer. "You," he said simply. "I never expected you. Your courage, your determination, your willingness to risk everything for what's right." His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I promised to leave after the job was done. It's what I've always done, never staying long enough to." He couldn't finish. Decades of practiced detachment making the words impossible to voice. Elizabeth completed his thought, her eyes never leaving his. Never staying long enough to care, to form attachments, to build something lasting. Samuel nodded, vulnerability evident in his expression, in a way it had never been before. "I've spent 15 years running from ghosts, Elizabeth, telling myself it was better that way." "And now?" Elizabeth asked, the question hanging between them, full of possibility. Samuel looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. "Now I find myself dreaming of things I gave up on long ago. A home, purpose, someone to share the quiet evenings with." The admission cost him something, but her smile made it worthwhile. "Copper Creek will need rebuilding after Harrison's damage," she said thoughtfully. "The bank will need honest leadership. The community will need healing." Samuel understood what she was offering. Not just herself, but a future, a purpose, a place to belong. "I'm not a banker," he said, with a small smile. "But I know something about protection, about justice." Elizabeth moved closer still, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. "We make a good team, Samuel Blackwood." The next morning brought a flurry of activity to Copper Creek. Judge Wilson convened an emergency session of the town council, presenting the evidence of Harrison Wells's crimes. Sheriff Taylor, faced with testimony from one of Harrison's own men who had turned against him during the cellar confrontation, had no choice but to arrest the banker. The bank charter, safely in Elizabeth's possession once more, ensured her controlling interest remained intact. By noon, the news had spread throughout the town. Elizabeth Thornton had reclaimed her father's legacy. Harrison Wells faced hanging for murder, and the foreclosures would be reviewed under new, more compassionate guidelines. Samuel stood on the porch of the judge's house, watching the town come to life with renewed hope, when Elizabeth joined him. "Judge Wilson says the bank directors have unanimously elected me as the new president," she said, a mixture of pride and determination in her voice. "They want to rename it Thornton Frontier Bank in my father's honor." Samuel smiled, genuinely pleased for her. "Your father would be proud. You've restored his vision." Elizabeth studied his face carefully. "The job is done, Samuel. The danger has passed. By your own words, this would be when you move on." The statement hung between them, a question disguised as an observation. Samuel looked out at the town, at the mountains beyond, at the endless horizon that had always called to him before. Then he looked back at Elizabeth, at the future he could see in her eyes. "Some promises," he said softly, "are meant to be broken." Copper Creek changed in the months that followed. Under Elizabeth's leadership, the bank revised its policies, working with struggling farmers and ranchers rather than foreclosing at the first sign of trouble. Harrison Wells faced justice for his crimes, though few in town mourned when he took his own life before the sentence could be carried out. Samuel found purpose as the new sheriff after Taylor resigned in disgrace for his complicity with Wells. The town watched with interest and eventual approval as the relationship between Elizabeth Thornton and Sheriff Blackwood evolved from professional respect to something deeper. When they married in the spring, Judge Wilson presiding, the entire town turned out to celebrate. The gunslinger who had promised to leave had found something more powerful than his wanderlust, a love that made him dream of forever. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.